A cargo ship sailing from Shanghai to Rotterdam through the Suez Canal covers roughly 20,000 kilometers. The same voyage along Russia's northern coast is closer to 13,000. That is a saving of somewhere around 10 to 15 days. In shipping, where a large vessel can cost tens of thousands of dollars a day to operate, a 2-week saving is not a marginal improvement. It is a different business. So here is the question this video is about, and my answer is going to be less enthusiastic than the framing suggests. The Northern Sea route is presented as a coming transformation of global trade and a strategic escape hatch for both Moscow and Beijing. I think the shipping case is largely overstated, the strategic case is real but different from what is advertised, and the gap between those two things explains why progress keeps disappointing. By the end you will know which specific numbers to watch. If the route works at scale, 3 things change at once. Egypt loses a substantial share of transit revenue. The strategic value of Malacca and Suez both decline. And Russia gains a corridor it controls end-to-end, at a moment when its other export routes have been curtailed. That last point is the one that matters most for our running argument. A Russia with a functioning northern corridor has an asset China needs and cannot build itself, which would be the first genuine counterweight to the dependency pattern I traced in the first 2 videos. So this is a real test. If the route matures, my dependency thesis needs qualifying. That is why I want to look at the numbers honestly rather than the announcements. The physical premise is sound. Arctic sea ice has declined substantially in extent and thickness over recent decades, and the navigable season has lengthened. Russia has the world's largest icebreaker fleet, including nuclear-powered vessels no other country operates. That is a genuine and hard-to-replicate asset. The route has been used commercially for years, mostly for one specific thing, moving Russian hydrocarbons out of the Yamal Peninsula. That traffic is real and it has grown. But note the distinction, because it is where most coverage goes wrong. There is destination traffic, ships going to or from a Russian Arctic port, and there is transit traffic, ships passing through from Asia to Europe. Those are different businesses, and the headline tonnage figures are dominated by the first. The first pillar of my skepticism is that container shipping and Arctic conditions are structurally mismatched. Container logistics run on schedule reliability, not raw speed. A network of ports, feeder vessels, rail connections, and customer contracts is built around a ship arriving in a predictable window. A route that is seasonal, ice-dependent, and occasionally requires waiting for icebreaker escort is fast on average and unreliable in variance. Shippers price variance heavily. This is why the industry absorbed a longer Cape of Good Hope routing during Red Sea disruption rather than switching to novel routes. Predictability beat distance. Then there is the fleet. Sailing in ice requires ice-classed hulls, which cost significantly more to build and are less efficient in open water for the rest of the year. You are asking an operator to buy a specialized, more expensive ship for a route usable part of the year. Insurance follows the same logic. Arctic transit premiums reflect limited search and rescue infrastructure across thousands of kilometers of sparsely populated coastline. None of these are unsolvable. All of them are expensive, and they compound. The second pillar is that the route's control structure is a feature for Moscow and a problem for everyone else. Russia requires notification, and in practice icebreaker escort and pilotage, for passage along much of the route. It sets the fees. It controls the escort scheduling. That is precisely the arrangement Beijing has spent 15 years trying to escape at Malacca. Trading a choke point controlled by the American Navy for a corridor controlled by the Russian state is not obviously an upgrade, it is a change of landlord. China has been careful here. It has described itself as a near-Arctic state and invested in Arctic shipping and research, but it has not made the route central to its logistics planning. The behavior again reveals the assessment. Compare Arctic commitments to what China has spent on overland Eurasian rail and on port access along the Indian Ocean. The Arctic is a hedge in the portfolio. It is not the strategy. The fourth factor is the one that insurance underwriters actually price, and it is not ice, it is what happens when something goes wrong. The Northern Sea route runs for thousands of kilometers along a coastline with very few ports, limited airfields, sparse population, and long distances between any 2 points capable of mounting a response. A fire, grounding, or engine failure in the North Sea puts a vessel hours from assistance. The same event halfway along the Russian Arctic coast can put it days away, in conditions where days matter. Add the communications problem. Geostationary satellites sit over the equator, and coverage degrades badly at very high latitudes. Polar orbit capacity has improved, but the redundancy that ships take for granted elsewhere is thinner. And then the environmental exposure, which is the one that concerns insurers most. A significant oil spill in Arctic conditions would be extraordinarily difficult to contain. Low temperatures slow the biological breakdown of hydrocarbons, ice complicates containment, and the response infrastructure is minimal. The liability tail on that event is very large and very hard to bound, which is exactly the kind of risk insurance markets price punitively or decline entirely. So when I said earlier that insurance premiums reflect limited infrastructure, this is the substance of it. And note that none of it improves as the ice retreats. Melting ice makes the route more navigable and does nothing whatsoever about rescue capacity, satellite coverage, or spill response. That is why I separate the two claims so insistently. The physical constraint is easing. The operational one is not, and it is the one underwriters are actually looking at. The fifth factor is the one that would have to change before any of the others mattered: who is willing to be the first mover. Container shipping is a network business. A route becomes viable when enough operators commit vessels to a scheduled rotation, which creates the port calls, feeder connections, and customer confidence that make it worth committing vessels to. That is a coordination problem, and it has a specific shape. The first operator to run a scheduled Arctic service bears the full cost of building the ecosystem and captures only part of the benefit. So the rational move for every individual operator is to wait for someone else to go first. Which is why announcements keep outnumbering sailings. There is also a reputational dimension that is rarely stated plainly. Several major European container lines have publicly declined to use the route, citing environmental concerns about Arctic operations. Whatever one thinks of that position, it removes a large fraction of the world's container capacity from the pool of potential first movers. And the remaining candidates, Chinese and Russian operators, face the governance problem I described earlier, where the route's controller is also a counterparty. So the constraint is not only ice, insurance, and rescue capacity. It is that the set of firms both able and willing to go first is very small, and shrinking for reasons unrelated to the Arctic itself. The strongest case against my skepticism is a straightforward one about time horizons. It goes like this. Every objection I raised is a snapshot objection. Ice extent continues to decline. The navigable season keeps lengthening. Ice-class fleets are being built now and will exist in a decade. Infrastructure, ports, rescue capability, communications, is under construction. Nobody judged the Suez Canal by its first 15 years of traffic. On this reading I am making the classic error of extrapolating current friction into a permanent condition, when the entire premise is that conditions are changing. That is a fair hit, and I want to concede the part that is right. The physical trend is real and it runs one direction. If I am wrong, this is why. But I would separate two claims that the argument runs together. That the route becomes more usable, very likely. That it becomes a major artery of global container trade, much less clear, because that second claim depends on the commercial and control factors, not the ice. Melting ice removes one constraint. It does not create a fleet, an insurance market, a rescue infrastructure, or a governance arrangement that non-Russian shippers are comfortable with. Those took Suez a century, in a far more benign environment, under international administration. So what would I actually expect? First, continued growth in destination traffic, hydrocarbons out of the Russian Arctic, because that cargo has no schedule sensitivity and a captive economic logic. That growth will keep producing impressive-looking tonnage headlines that say little about transit viability. Second, transit traffic that grows but stays small relative to Suez, and that is dominated by bulk and project cargo rather than containers. Third, and this is the specific thing to watch, whether any major non-Chinese, non-Russian container line commits ice-class newbuilds to scheduled Arctic service. That is the falsifiable test. If Maersk or MSC orders ice-class container ships for regular northern rotation, I am wrong and the transformation is real. Until then, the announcements are ahead of the capital. My read is that the Arctic route is a genuine Russian asset that is more valuable politically than commercially, and that it does not, on current evidence, rebalance the relationship I described in the earlier videos. Russia controls a corridor that China finds useful and is not willing to depend on. That is a real card, but it is a small one against pipeline geography and currency settlement. The test I gave is deliberately falsifiable, ice-class container newbuilds on scheduled service. If you see that order announced, hold me to this video. Next, the overland alternative, and why Eurasian Rail keeps underperforming its promise.